QSO Today, episode 186, Bernie Walt ZS4TX. Before we get started, I want to announce that SodaBeams has become a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast. SodaBeams is an amazing provider of portable antennas and equipment to take into the field to operate ham radio. More on SodaBeams later in this episode. This episode is then sponsored by SodaBeams, by QRP Labs, my favorite kit company, and by you listeners who have made generous donations and have become listener sponsors. With this support, I'm able to keep these interesting interviews coming to you each week. Thanks. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth Forzed, 1UG, your host. We return to South Africa, where I had the great pleasure to have a QSO with Bernie Walt ZS4TX. Bernie has been a ham for many years, loves to contest on HF, and operates 2 remote control EME or moonbound stations on 2 and 6 meters away from the noise pollution of his residential neighborhood. We discuss this and more in this episode of QSO Today. ZS4TX, this is Eric Forzed, 1UG. Are you there, Bernie?
Hi, Eric. Yes, I receive you loud and clear. Good morning.
Good morning, Bernie. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Before we start, can you explain exactly where you are in the world?
Eric, I'm located in Bloemfontein. It's in the central part of South Africa, about 400 kilometers south of Johannesburg and about 900 kilometers northeast of Cape Town.
And as we were talking pre-show, if you take the plane from Johannesburg to Cape Town, you go right over your house. Isn't that right?
That's correct. Sometimes when you fly to the United States from here, we fly to Johannesburg, then down to Cape Town, and then to the States. So we basically start from Bloemfontein, and from Johannesburg we fly over Bloemfontein again to get to the United States.
Let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. When and how did it start for you?
Since I remember, I've always been interested in radios and electronics and stuff. At age, say, 5-6 years, we went to my uncle's farm there in the Kalahari, close to the Botswana border, and he was a radio ham, actually quite famous. I found out later, Peter Botha ZS4PB, or Push Button, the African Cowboy, and he had a really above average HF station on his farm, and then he had a huge 18-meter mast and big rotatable antennas. So I saw these antennas and I saw his home-built radios, and I really became interested and sat there with him in the evenings while he talked to everyone and all over the world tuning the equipment. So I realized I also one day want to be a radio ham, and I would say that was my first exposure to amateur radio, and from then on I just became interested in electronics.
But did you have any resources in Bloemfontein where you grew up?
I actually grew up in Vryburg in the Northern Cape, which is about 300 kilometers northwest from here, and most of the time was on a farm. And our resources were extremely limited in the sense of people that were also radio hams or interested in electronics were quite limited in that area. Our closest radio ham was 100 kilometers away. So I went to the library, I read all the books about electronics I could find, about amateur radio, found magazines here and there when we went to the bigger towns. So I basically read a lot about amateur radio, and I listened on the old AM radio. So the resources were extremely limited. Basically, when at one stage we moved to Kimberley in the Northern Cape, and where my parents worked for 3 years before we went back to the farm. And there we were introduced to CB radio, which actually opened the world for me completely. That's where I learned to build antennas and test SWR and how things work. Many people say the Elmer is this famous call sign and that famous call sign. I don't remember call signs like that being my Elmer. I remember a famous guy, Yogi Bear. He's a silent key now. He gave me a big, huge valve receiver for a few months to play with, and I tuned the bands, and that's where I learned how a BFO works and things like that. And that combined with the CB radio experience I had, I think gave me a good base to work from. And the concept of Elmering was actually, for me, an unknown concept, because I sort of taught myself. I wouldn't say I never learned from anyone when I was young. I probably didn't know I was learning, but I never had someone specific that said, do this, do that. And I think that may have been an advantage because if you look at someone having an Elmer with a single dipole or just a wire antenna, and he emulates that Elmer, that's eventually how he's also going to end up. So if the first person you see has a 100-foot tower and a big antenna, that's who you want to emulate.
Now, did Yogi Bear, was he a ham?
No, he was just a CB operator.
And that was his handle, his
yeah,
right?
That was his handle.
Uh-huh. Now, it's my understanding in North America, Citizens Band radio was in the 27 megahertz band, and they were limited to 5 watts output. Was that similar, a similar equipment there in South Africa?
Yes, exactly the same equipment. We had radios like the President Grant, all the presidents, when the radios were named after all the U.S. presidents, they were Italian radios and different equipment available, but it was also limited to 5 watts on AM or 4 watts on AM and 12 watts on SSB, and you were not allowed to talk overseas, but we took the opportunities as they were presented.
And those opportunities were did you build big antennas?
Yes, as a matter of fact, when I got my first 2 radios that my father bought for me and my brother, also CB handheld radios, we immediately set off trying to see how far these radios can talk. So that's where I became interested in actually improving a station, trying to get talk to a further distance, not necessarily overseas, but around the block. We changed antennas and then see if we can add another block. And then we went to the map and measured the distance. So that made me interested. And that's when I realized that a radio is not really the important item in a station. The most important is obviously the antenna, the height of the antenna, the effectivity of the antenna. And at one stage, we were the only CB station in Kimberley sporting a stacked, rotatable 3/3 CB Yagi antenna. And that's where the experimentation started.
And were you still running 5 watts at that point into those antennas?
Yes, 12 watts on SSB.
What kind of DX did you actually work on with that array?
Well, local distances was typically in the 50 to 100 kilometer radius, but then the added antenna opened up sporadic E to a certain extent. We have a very, very limited sporadic E in South Africa. And what we found is with a bigger antenna, we could do backscatter by beaming towards sunrise and then working the whole of South Africa. We were not allowed to talk overseas. It was not allowed. So we basically stuck with what was available to us.
And when did you get your first ham license?
I was licensed in 1984. I actually wrote the exam twice. So when I was 11 and 12 years old, I failed. And then when I was in the second last year of school, Standard 9 it was called, my mother took me out of school for a week and she said, now learn and then you write the exam. So I eventually passed. And then in 1984, I was issued ZS4TX. And initially, I played a bit on VHF. I had a Kenwood TR9130 and built myself a 14-element Yagi. And I worked quite a few stations on 2 meter, but then obviously you have to talk to them every day because we also have limited 2 meter operators here. So I moved over to HF.
I see. The TR930, what kind of radio is that?
It's a Kenwood TR9130. It's the 25 watt all mode Kenwood 2 meter transceiver.
I see. So you operated that for a while on single sideband?
Yeah, single sideband and CW and FM, trying to get remote repeaters. My furthest QSO was with the ZS6ALE. He's famous for working Hawaii and setting a world record on EME. He was located, I think, about 650 kilometers from me. And then at that stage, email was not existent, so I wrote him a letter asking for a sked. He wrote back, he said, yes, we can try. Why not? When do you want to do it? So I wrote back, let's try this date. He said, he wrote back, no, that date I'm not available. So I wrote back to him and he said, okay, let's try this date. And I could only operate over weekends because I went to school during the week. And then eventually we made the contact and he was as delighted as I was. But that was about the furthest I've managed to talk on 2 meters, or that was on CW at that stage. So only later on I ventured into EME and different modes on 2 meters.
What's your current rig?
I've a few radios because I operate remote stations as well, but at home I have an ICOM IC7800, and then at the remote sites I use the ICOM IC7100. I've one on 2 meters and one on 6 meters. And then for the HF remote site, I have an ICOM IC756 Pro 3. The reason why I like the 7100s is that they can be switched off by software from remotely, and you don't have to use the controller. You actually just sit there with one single block of radio, and it's a fantastic little radio.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the radio of choice for your home station?
Well, it's not of choice. It's what I have here, but I prefer this radio. It's a very nice radio. Actually, I got it from a friend of mine. Believe it or not, I would not have been able to afford this radio. And you may hear his call sign later on in the chat. The ICOM IC7800. It's a fantastic radio. I have a 12-meter tower here at the back, and then I've got 2 OptiBeam antennas, 40, 20, and 15 and 10 meters on the one antenna, and the other one for the walk bands, 30, 17, and 12. There's a picture on my QRZ.com page of the antenna setup. So I do operate here from the home as well. Also have an 80-meter vertical, but obviously with the electronic noises being generated here in town, it's not so easy to work weak signals. And at this stage, I'm basically on HF, just chasing a few new ones here and there because of on most of the bands work close to 300 or more entities. So they are getting rarer and more difficult to work. So the remote stations, I have another HF remote station, which is actually, we built it as the ZS9X contest site. About 25 kilometers out of town. It's an abandoned military installation where there's a few big wire lock periodic antennas, and then I also installed 2 OptiBeam antennas, one beaming east, one beaming west fixed, and then a few vertical antennas for the lower bands. So I can log in there via a wireless connection and then operate my 756 Pro 3 via that link, and there it is extremely quiet. It's slightly elevated on a hill, and basically anything that comes on, I can work from there. It's being a remote site and far out of town, the electricity supply is not so very reliable, but it does work. And we've done a few contests from there, multi-2 contesting, where we actually go to the site and sit there and operate as the ZS9X. And then the other remote station I have is where I have my 2 meter and 6 meter EME stations. There are also pictures of that on my QRZ.com page. I've initially had my 2 meter EME array in town, but the noise was just too much. So I moved the station out, and I've never been sorry. I can work almost anyone with a 13 or 14 element Yagi and 100 watts, which I would never have been able to do while having that station in town. And it's a huge problem all over the world now.
Okay, and that's where you're running the 7100s, right? For the EME?
That's correct, yes.
How much power are you running?
Well, on the 7100, I use amplifiers. On 2 meters and 6 meters, I have 1 kW. So I basically run the 7100 at 2 or 3 watts to drive the amplifiers. I use the ITELAB block amplifier on 2 meter, and on 6 meters I have an old Larkan TV amplifier that was modified to work on 6 meters, and I run that on 6 meters.
Are you using some kind of remote control software? The 7100 actually has remote control capability.
Yes, it does. But what I do is I use TeamViewer. I keep it very, very basic. TeamViewer on the PC that is on site, and then obviously the radio is connected to the PC, and then I run the actual ICOM software on that PC, which is basically the same as having to run that RSBA1 program on your remote station where you actually operate from. Because then you don't have the amount of data flowing between your operating site and where the station is located. So I use TeamViewer to control the radio, and then obviously to see it's 99% digital mode. So you only have to open a WSJT program and see the PCs talking to each other. Rarely do I need to convey the audio, and for that I use either REMAUD from DF3CB or I use Skype. Skype is fantastic. In the last 3 years, I actually ran a remote station 1,000 kilometers from here, just on 6 meters to complete my 6-meter DXCC, because living in Bloemfontein is a bit far south for proper trans-equatorial propagation, or TEP. So I decided to finish my DXCC on 6 meters, I need to move. And within the rules, if you are in the borders of the country, I found a site right at the northernmost part of South Africa on a small hill where there was a two-way radio eyesight. I spoke to the owners and I installed my 6-meter Yagi, a 5-element with a rotator, and also the 7100 there. I just ran 100 watts. And I worked 95 countries in 18 months that I operated from there, so eventually finishing my 6-meter DXCC.
Okay, so now I've heard about EME operators doing this. Most of the EME operators that I've interviewed on the QSO Today podcast are using the rotators that have the up, down, right, left. But what you're saying is that you were operating 6 meters with a Yagi on a rotator, so you're pointing at the horizon where the moon is?
With the remote site in Dongola, in the northern part of South Africa, that I just used to complete my 6-meter DXCC, that one was just horizon azimuth rotatable antenna. And I was able to receive the bigger EME stations while pointing at the moon set or moonrise, where you get some added gain in that first, say, 7 or 8 degrees. But the intention was never to operate EME from that site. I needed a few countries in Europe. I managed to work a few very rare ones in the Pacific over a path that opens maybe for 30 minutes every 11 years. So I was lucky to work a few rare ones. And then I took that station down, and now that radio is now connected at the EME site. And at the EME site, my 2-meter and 6-meter array has full elevation and azimuth capabilities, all done remotely. And I use a program called PST Rotator, which actually talks to the rotator control box, and everything is done automatically. You just switch it on, you set it to auto tracking, and there it goes. All you have to do is click the mouse. It's actually disturbingly easy.
So it actually knows where the moon is when you decide to operate?
Yes, the program has an algorithm inside, and it gives information to the control box, and the antenna just turns every 2 or 3 minutes. It follows the moon. You set it up once and you leave it.
Now, is that on commercial power, or is that a solar powered site?
No, it's commercial power. There's an 11 kV line feeding the farm, and then I have a 220 volt line into the container for the amplifiers and the rotators.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yes, well, being interested in radios and electronics, the idea to study electronic engineering was always in my mind. So we had to do 2 years military service compulsory. So in 1985, I was actually going down to Stellenbosch to study, but then I decided, let me finish this military training first. I did my 2 years military training, and then after that, I started studying in Pretoria at the Technikon. It's a technical college, and then I studied there for a year, and we had to do practical work as well. So I worked in Vryburg, close to where my parents lived on the farm. And after that, I moved to Bloemfontein, where I continued studying, and eventually around 1999, I ended up with a master's degree in technology, electronic engineering from the Central University of Technology. So many of the projects that I had to do during my studies was also based around amateur radio. So when we had to build an antenna, I built an amateur radio antenna. When we had to build a receiver, I built an amateur radio receiver. So in a sense, I had an advantage with compared to the other students. I always knew what to do. I always had a resource to go to get something to do. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity that amateur radio offered me. That helped for sure.
And what do you do now professionally?
I own my own business. Actually, I have a partner, and we are in the telecommunication business doing two-way radios. Also, we do work for the cell phone companies, swapping out equipment, doing upgrades and site optimization. And then anything else that has to do with alarm systems. Being in South Africa, you have to have an alarm system. So there's a huge market, CCTV. So basically the full spectrum, but the main income of our company at this stage is the cell phone companies. That does a lot of work, and they are continuously upgrading.
And now this time out for a message about Soda Beams. Soda Beams has joined QSO Today as a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast. I want to thank Richard Newstead, G3CWI, and his team for their support of QSO Today. I approached Soda Beams because many of you are taking your ham radio out of your HOA neighborhoods and into the parks, backcountry, and mountain summits. Soda Beams is the perfect complement for outdoor operational accessories. Before Soda Beams signed up, I purchased some equipment to kick the tires on the new sponsor. I ordered a 10-meter fiberglass push-up mast and a 3-band portable dipole antenna system in preparation for outdoor operation using my new QRP Labs QCX transceiver. My order arrived only a few days later in Israel, and I must say that the products were impressive. My 3-band antenna came in a ripstop nylon bag with wire and coax neatly wrapped on 3 storage hangers and included some ground stakes to tie off the ends. Generous attention was paid to the finish of the products, making them durable and easy to use. The push-up mast fits in my backpack and was also included in a ripstop nylon bag to keep it safe for use. It truly does extend to 10 meters or 30 feet. Richard has videos on the Soda Beams website to show you how to properly set up the antenna and mast outdoors on your next ham radio outing. Soda Beams has everything that you need, including parts, operating accessories, and test equipment that you can carry into the field to do your summits on the air or any other outdoor operation with your amateur radio HF transceiver. Check out the Soda Beams website by clicking on the Soda Beams logo on this episode's show notes page or in the sponsor section of the QSO Today website to get to Soda Beams. Be sure to tell Richard or any of his staff that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our conversation. Now, I noticed the last time I was in South Africa, when I was telling you earlier that I was walking the dog, at the top of the hill I noticed on the tour radio towers a lot of what looked like ISM band or like Wi-Fi microwave links. Is that used a lot in South Africa for connecting either security systems together or other kinds of telecommunications devices together?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was also involved with a ISM band based internet supply or internet service company, and the 5 gigahertz band, 5.8 gigahertz band, and the 2.4 gigahertz band were initially not open for the supply of internet, but it grew and grew and grew, and at this stage the amount of work that is being generated by the companies using that technology, they've sort of decided not to police it anymore. And the 5.8 gigahertz band is extensively used all over South Africa to supply remote sites. And obviously people want internet, and that's a growing concept of using the ISM band for, it's been like that. I think it's being done like that all over the world now, or in most of the countries I've been to. I've seen a lot of those 5 gigahertz antennas. It's getting crowded. Everyone is changing channels here and there, and they're getting interference. And then they are migrating as their companies grow. They migrate to licensed band. So it has a stepping stone. It's basically like the CB of internet Wi-Fi.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Now, is it possible that most of South Africa now has internet service, even the most rural areas?
No, there are still a lot of places that do not have service, although most of South Africa is covered by cell phone suppliers of internet, but the cost of that internet is still prohibitive for someone that is not earning a lot of money. So I'd say it's available almost everywhere, but it is expensive.
Let's change gears for just a second. You mentioned in a letter to me that you sent that your parents taught you one of the most important concepts of Elmering, but perhaps I think more about human relations. Can you explain what that was?
Oh, yes. Well, not having an Elmer, I sat and thought, what have I learned? Who taught me anything when you contacted me? And I realized that actually I learned from my parents a lot. They were not radio hams, but they obviously knew the hobby, and they've been to people who has operated on a radio, and they taught me to basically to respect the other radio users, to respect the spectrum use, and they always gave me the opportunity to buy stuff and to experiment, and they supported me. So I'd say if I have to say who has been an Elmer, I'll put them on the list as well.
You are a world-class contester and DX operator, winning a number of international prizes and competing in 3 executive WRTC contests. How did contesting start for you?
I've always been slightly competitive my whole life, and then my local DX friend ZS4TX, Chris, I think you have spoken to him as well. He introduced me to HF international contesting. Initially, when I got my license, I saw there's a ZS contest on HF. I took part, and I actually won the first year CW prize. So I thought, this is nice. I actually enjoy it. And then in 2000, Chris ZS4TX was elected to go to the first WRTC that I had the opportunity to go with him, and that's basically where my serious contesting started. I enjoy it. It's a weekend or 2 in a year that you sit there and you make a lot of contacts, and you practice your CW skills, you improve your CW skills, and you basically contest against yourself because the guys who win the contest are situated in either good locations, or they select a band that is and that has an advantage for them. So that's what I did. I selected a band. We are fortunate in South Africa to have good propagation on the 10 and 15 meter bands. So when I went single band, that's basically where I concentrated my operating to be able to be competitive. And that's the nice thing of contesting. You can either contest against someone else who's in your area, or you can decide to contest against people who are not in your area, who actually has a completely different propagation setup than you have, or you can contest against yourself. And I found by trying to beat my previous score, I found much more pleasure in contesting than trying to beat someone else.
When I turn on the radio on the weekend, I hear probably contests every single weekend coming from Europe. Down there in South Africa, what do you hear on the weekend?
We do hear the contests. I only take part in 1 or 2 contests a year, and basically the last 3 years I've not been that active because of work pressure. But we do hear the contests, especially on the 15 and 10 meter band, where we have a direct link into Europe. The bands are busy. So we get exactly the same, maybe not at the same level on the lower bands, where we have a lot of static because of the huge amount of lightning that we have in this area, but we do get the same activity here.
What kind of precautions do you take to protect yourself against lightning?
I had a lot of lightning damage initially on my two-way radio sites and also once on my amateur radio installation. And then I studied all the information that I could get. And nowadays, what I do is I earth everything. I make sure that at my home station, when there's lighting in the vicinity, I unplug everything. But obviously on the remote sites, you cannot do that. So I took the documents that were given to us for the cell phone installations and how those earthing must be done. And the concept of shunting everything is what I use to make sure that when the lightning strikes in the vicinity, that most of it is shunted past the equipment. Obviously on a direct strike, you can't do much, but my EME site have been standing for 2 years now with the antennas connected to the radio, everything without any damage. Hopefully we don't get a lightning strike, a direct lightning strike there, but I wouldn't say I've won the battle with lightning, but definitely progressed a lot from the beginning.
Now, when you say shunting, are you talking about you actually remotely short the feed line to the ground?
No, what I mean is I try to provide a bypass for the lightning so that the least path of resistance is via the shunting cable or shunting path towards earth, so that there's no current flowing through the equipment. So I earth the coax at the top, at the bottom, and at the radio, all to a central point. And then wherever there's a rotator, I just bypass that rotator bearing as well. So, and obviously the 2 meter and 6 meter antennas, I also have a relay at the bottom, isolating the equipment from the antenna for an added isolation to any possible lightning strike. But shunting the electricity generated by a lightning strike is basically what I try to do.
Do you use gas tube arresters?
No, not at all. The problem is if they get struck, you don't know always. So that adds to the maintenance of the site. So far, it's worked for me. I do the spark gap arresters on some of the sites, and they don't need that much maintenance as the gas arresters.
Yeah, I've actually seen amateur radio operators using spark plugs, automobile spark plugs on balanced lines to use as spark gap arresters for lightning. Very interesting. Do you do any remote lightning detection in those remote sites?
Well, all I do is I switch the antennas off. I have a relay connected to the equipment antenna. So I just switch the relay off remotely to isolate the antenna from the equipment. But the rest is done by proper earthing and thick cabling towards a single earthing point.
Now, it's my understanding that the specifications for cellular telephone sites may include, digging trenches around the building and putting copper in the ground and building a ground field. Is that kind of the work that you do in order to create, this earth ground that works around these sites?
Oh, yes, I've done that. At the EME site, I've three long flat copper strips, about 10 meters long, a meter underground. So I've done that part as well, and that's necessary. You need a proper ground to avoid any damage to your equipment.
Yeah, I get that. I'm thinking I need to, at least at my house, I need to bury an old automobile under the ground or something like that. I'm sitting on limestone, so it makes it a little bit hard.
Okay, yeah. Now we have soft soil, so I could dig in a meter long trench, and I put that flat copper earth in there, and so far I've been lucky. No damage at all.
What's your favorite DX contest?
I do take part in the CQ Worldwide CW, usually at the end of November. There's a lot of activity. There's a lot of new stations to work. I used the CQ Worldwide contest to build my country total, the DXCC country total. And over a weekend, you can work 150 countries on a single band. So there's no excuse not to get a DXCC over a weekend if you take part in the CQ Worldwide. So that's my favorite contest.
Are you surprised by the number of CW operators that seem to be coming into the bands?
Not actually. I predicted that the amount of CW will increase once, and I use the word decriminalized. Once CW was decriminalized, the pressure of people having to do CW and then doing it and hating it and then leaving it afterwards disappeared. Nowadays, people want to get on CW because they see the expeditions use CW and they make more contacts on CW. It's easier. One of the reasons why I started on CW, or why I maintained a high level of activity on CW, was when my children were still very young. They didn't sleep so well. So when I had to operate radio, it was with the headphones on and I couldn't talk because they will wake up. So I stuck to CW, and nowadays I just stay on CW. I think I've made 99% of my contacts, if not more, just on CW. And that was one of the reasons. And then obviously the activity is increasing there, and the long distance contacts are possible on CW nowadays. Amazing contacts are being made from PC to PC, which I do every now and then, but I don't find the satisfaction in that as all than with CW.
Do you have a favorite bug or keyer that you use on CW?
Not really. I do have a Bengali paddle that I use. I used to have a normal, when I started off, a normal HK1 pounding key, and I used that for many years. And then eventually, when I got an electronic keyer, I also built myself an electronic keyer. I used the bencher paddle for many years, and then my wife bought me the Bengali paddle. But most of the CW are being sent with a keyboard anyway in contests, so you just do fill-ins with a paddle. And I've actually neglected my CW sending a lot by using the keyboard, and that's one of the disadvantages if you do contesting. Very, very rarely that you find a contester sending CW with a pedal and then logging on the keyboard. Everyone is just using the keyboard, and I think that makes it easier for people entering CW, that they don't have to use a pedal, because you also need some skills to operate a pedal. And then with the amount of decoding programs that are available, someone not knowing any CW will be able to make a lot of contacts in a contest, or not even a contest, just over a weekend, sitting at the radio looking at what his PC is decoding. And many people are using it like that. We've had DXCCs issued recently here in South Africa, and I know for a fact those guys do not know CW at all.
Well, I guess, CW was the first digital mode.
Yes, and it's not bad. It's good for the mode, but these new digital modes like FT8 is taking absolutely over. And I've made a few contacts on FT8, but it does not excite me at all.
Just about every interview that I've done, probably the last 10 interviews, FT8 has come up as a topic of conversation, with some positive and with some negative. Yeah, it is interesting, and it seems to work. With the sunspot cycle being down in the bottom right now, FT8 seems to be working quite well.
Yeah, and it has suddenly given the below average station the opportunity to work weak DX. Guys are with wire antennas and 5 watts are working amazing contacts, and they are stacking up DX totals like you would never do in 20 years with a big antenna in conditions like this. And also with the amount of noise that are in towns nowadays because of all the LED lights and plasma TVs and unregulated stuff, that mode is here to stay for sure.
Well, I think Israel is probably very much like South Africa in terms of the amount of unregulated switching supplies and stuff that are, coming in and being used for just about everything, including, as you say, LED lights. How bad is the noise conditions in your town?
I would say it is really bad. When I moved here to this QTH 7 years ago, I had a clear band. There were no noise or no local noise that I could detect. And nowadays, when I switch on in the evenings on 40 meters, the S meter sits at S7, S8 all the time. We have gate motors with unregulated power supplies all over the town, and they are generating extreme noise, especially on 6 meters. And the noise level that it generates is such that it is just below the level allowed for the generation of noise. So I would say the regulations regulating the levels of interference are not keeping up with what is being generated nowadays. Once you kill noise, there's a different level of noise. So you never stop killing noise. Always when I kill something, you find a different level of noise or a different device making noise. And it never used to be like that.
And at this point, the South African government doesn't see this as a potential security threat.
Well, I'm not able to talk on their behalf, but it is not there's not much being done about it.
Yeah, I guess as long as a UHF and 800 megahertz radio seem to work, nobody seems to care much about what's happening in the lower bands. That's my observation anyway. Yes,
the HF is a problem. They do not respond to HF complaints. Once the noise complaint is above 30 megahertz, they do respond. But even then, the levels allowed is still too high for a weak signal station on 6 meters or 2 meters. If you have a minus 70 dB noise interference, that's still adequate for them. And for you, it makes the band useless.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. You're a veteran de-expeditioner as well. Which de-expedition was the most challenging for you and why?
I've done a few de-expeditions. I wouldn't call myself a veteran de-expeditioner. My first real big de-expedition was with the team that went to Penguin Island, which is now a deleted country. In the early 90s, we operated as ZS0Z from Penguin Island with Chris Berger ZS6EZ. We also did a few VHF expeditions with a helicopter flying from site to site, and I enjoyed that a lot. But I would say in terms of effort going and setting up a station on a remote island, the Penguin Island expedition was one of the most involved. I've done a few single operator expeditions. I went to Mauritius with my wife 2 years ago. I operated just single band 6 meter EME from there, made about 40 contacts, and I enjoyed having the holiday with the 6 meter EME. It was not necessarily challenging. Getting past customs with a big box and antenna was a bit challenging. I enjoy the expeditioning. I have not been to one of the real remote Pacific Island type operations. Maybe one day I'd like to go, but obviously the cost of that is too much.
Right. Minutes before we got on the Skype together to have this interview, I saw that the Beauvais Island de-expedition was scuttled as a result of weather and ship engine failure. So, even with the best laid plans of men are waylaid by some technical difficulty.
Of course, that's always the problem. You never know what the conditions are going to be. After 10 days on a boat, you cannot predict anything. They obviously looked at the historical charts of weather patterns and they picked the best time. But if the weather is not there and you risk health and limb to get on the island, it's just not worth it. And that is a really, really sad event. I feel sorry for them. And I hope that people will still contribute when they get back, because there's huge cost involved with that expedition. It would have been one of the best expeditions if they managed to get on that island. Fortunately for myself, I do have Beauvais worked and confirmed on several bands, but there are still people who has never even heard Beauvais on the band and maybe never will, because it just gets more and more difficult with the weather patterns changing.
You appear to work just about every mode. You said in the letter to me that your biggest challenge is to occupy the allocated spectrum, especially in remote areas. Can you elaborate what you meant here?
Well, the biggest challenge in my mind to ham radio is to occupy the spectrum that we've been given. Now with the FT8 mode, when you tune over the band, say 15 meters, there's nothing going on except here on the digital spot, there sits this peak of signals. So everyone is concentrated around a signal or around that specific part of the band and working everyone all over the world while the rest of the band sits there empty. Very little CW, very little SSB, and a lot of signals on that FT8 or JT65 allocated part of the band. And especially in countries where spectrum are not regulated so much, we stand the chance that someone can tune over the band and say, okay, here is an open spectrum, let's use it. And it has been happening on 40 meters. There are several African stations, commercial broadcast stations, taking up the band. And I relate that directly to the lack of activity. And with this digital mode prevalence, we may be enhancing the opportunity for the pirates to come and occupy our bands.
What kind of strategy then would you recommend for occupying those other parts of the band with these other modes when the bands are, mostly dead?
I wish I knew. I've thought about it. I thought about it very hard, but I don't have an answer except for maybe more SSB contests, more CW contests, because those are really the things that keep the bands busy and that will deter anyone from taking up the band. But apart from that, the normal old activity that you had in the late 60s, 70s, where a lot of people came on, a lot of SSB contacts were made, and the bands were full, that is not happening anymore.
No, I understand that there's some, conventions in terms of which digital modes you operate where, so you can actually find the other digital mode operators. But is there any reason to not operate CW or the digital modes in other parts of the band?
Apart from the fact that the digital modes need so little bandwidth to communicate, several contacts can happen within a kilohertz or two, it does not make sense to move out of that band because you will end up calling CQ and no one will hear you because everyone is concentrated on that part of the band and they don't have to move because everything can happen within that small spectrum. CW, obviously, there's a lot of space for CW and it needs to be taken up. But the digital modes are actually drawing the people from the CW and SSB modes. It's an easy QSO. It's a mouse click. The PC does 99% of the contact. It's actually automated. So you have to click 2 times to make the contact, and you just use that little spectrum. The rest gets unused.
Do you do any operation in the bands above 2 meters then, UHF, microwave, anything like that?
I'm busy building a 70 centimeter EME station. So hopefully within the next 2 months or so, I'll be on 70 centimeters EME as well. I'm trying to complete my DXCC on 2 meters. I still need 3 entities to get to 100. And then hopefully apply for my 11th DXCC band. And then start the slow run on 70 centimeters, where there's not a lot of activity, but people do go on the expeditions. They do take a long single Yagi and 500 watts or so, and I've designed my station that I would be able to work those stations as well. So hopefully within the next 2-3 months I'll be on 70 centimeters.
As a ham radio operator, do you tend to focus on a single band and mode for a sprint in order to master it, to understand it, to work the most stations on it?
Yes, I do. My first big antenna was a 4-element KLM 40-meter big sticker antenna. So I put that up on the farm there near Vryburg. And I only went there over weekends because I was still in the military or studying. And then I just spent all my time on 40 meters. I made that my specialist band. I ended up just needing North Korea on 40 meters. I've worked all the other countries. So if you spend a lot of time on that band, you obviously get everything that is available. And I do that when I wanted to work the walk bands. I just stayed on 30 meters, 17 and 12 meters, trying to get all the countries that are active on those bands. And if you look at the DXCC list of people that has achieved huge numbers, you will see that they are mostly active on 20 meters. They have huge antennas on 20 meters. So, and they spend their time on that single band, and then they obviously rack up huge totals. I try to spread my activity over all the bands, but like on the low bands 160, with all the static that we have here, I was very active in the late 90s on 160 meters, and after a few years of operation with all that static, you do get tired, and then you pick another band. So it does happen.
Do you recommend that strategy for someone who wants to gain expertise?
Yes, especially if you have a small station. Pick your best band for your location, build the best antenna that you can, and optimize your station for that band, and then start operating. It's better to have a good signal on a single band than having a weak signal on all the bands.
You mentioned in your message to me that your wife swore not to marry an amateur radio operator. Can you give me some background and explain what happened?
Actually, our whole family has amateur radio licenses. My wife is ZS4TZ, my eldest boy ZS4TY, his name is Luan, and then Ilandre ZS4TU. They are both 25 and 21 years old now. My wife's father was also a radio ham, and he was a big SSB operator, and he used to talk on SSB all the time from his car while they were traveling. And I think that maybe irritated his family. And then I also spoke to him many years before I knew my wife. I spoke to her father on the radio, and we actually became quite good radio friends. And then later when we met, she told me that she never wanted to marry a radio ham. And then that unfortunately was not to be.
If I asked you what kind of impact amateur radio has had on your family life, your response would be?
Well, it's basically been my hobby, and I've been supported by them, and I've obviously irritated them with the amount of time that I spend on the radio, and they've had their fair share of holding this rope, pull there, and help me with this, and I can't really say it's been a family outing, but we each have our own hobbies, and we go for it full time.
Have your sons pursued any electronic careers of their own, or have they gone off in different directions?
They're in the software environment. They both studied BSc IT, and my eldest son has finished his honors degree, and they are both working now at a company where they design software, develop software. And Ilandre ZS4TU is now also studying for his honors degree in BSc IT program development, software development.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Well, I wouldn't say it's something that excites me now. It's a continuous thing. For me, amateur radio was a gateway to my profession, and even for someone who has a license for 30 years plus, there are still so many new facets to explore. There are new things to learn and explore every day. And the knowledge that is available is unparalleled to any other hobby in the world. Most of the knowledge is available on the internet. It's free, and that shortens the learning curve to start any new project. So my excitement comes from starting new projects, optimizing the project, and then just looking for the next one to do. You must not get stuck in a rut where you switch on your radio every day just on 80 meters to talk to the person next door. That would not excite me. And amateur radio offers the ability to grow and to explore new things every day.
Do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Well, like we spoke previously, I'd say pick a band and optimize your antenna. Get yourself active again. Talk to someone that has recently operated. What is going on? Try and find a new Elmer. But the main message that I would like to convey to someone starting amateur radio or returning to amateur radio is to start doing it. Don't say you want to do this, you want to do that, and setting the bar too high for yourself. Get something, start it up, build an antenna, get your radio, and just do it. Don't wait. No one else is going to do it for you. You must do it for yourself.
Right, and you don't have to spend thousands of dollars to do that.
Not at all. There are a lot of entry level radios that you can build, that you can buy. Wire is cheap. To get into amateur radio is not an expensive effort nowadays. Obviously, if you want to go be a big contester or a big DXer, you need a bigger hardware, which is going to be more expensive. But a lot of fun can be had by just a handheld and a small antenna, even satellite operation. That's something that I've not explored yet. I've done a few satellite contacts. It did not excite me too much, but that's something that can be done very cheaply.
Bernie, this has been a very pleasant conversation and a delight to me. And I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. So with that, I want to wish you 73.
Thank you, Eric. Nice talking to you. Really appreciate it.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bernie. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in ZS4TX or ZS4TX in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. I want to thank again both SodaBeams and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Be sure to show your support by clicking on the links on the show notes pages that get to these fine sponsors. Finally, tell all your friends about QSO Today. QSO Today is now available in the iHeartRadio and in the iTunes Store, and now a host of podcast services and applications. I still use Stitcher as my favorite. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.